Here with us today is Graeme Rendall. He's a UFO researcher and the author of many books. But Graeme, tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you stumbled into the UFO topic, if you don't mind.
No, don't mind at all. Thanks for the invitation as well. Yeah, I've been interested in UFOs from a fairly early age, from probably about the age of 8 or 9. So you're going back to the mid to late 1970s there. So quite a long time. I was interested in aeroplanes since I was about 4 years old. I used to build model kits. My mother used to buy me them to keep me quiet, basically, when I was a child. And also, I was interested in science fiction from an early age. So I used to read things like Isaac Asimov, A.E. Doc Smith, some of the classic science fiction, the golden age. But all the books I used to read had one thing in common. They had some really, really nice artwork of spacecraft on the front cover. And my mother, God bless her, she basically bought me another book. She thought it was another one of these Isaac Asimov titles because it had a flying saucer on the front. But it turned out to be a book about UFOs. I read it anyway, even though it wasn't really what I was interested in. And it blew my mind, basically. So all the things I was reading about in terms of fiction seemed to be, some of it seemed to be fact, if you like. And I went from there, basically. So, collecting all the books I could find from the local library and reading them cover to cover. People would buy me books for my birthday. And I just sort of amassed more and more knowledge, like a lot of people do. You've probably heard the term, people like kids are like sponges in terms of information. They just absorb information. Well, I was one of those nerdy kids who, once I got kind of hooked on a subject, I just wanted to know more and more and more and more. And well, here I am today, writing about it myself. So, I've come full circle from reading to writing about the subject.
Yeah, very interesting. And since you like science fiction or liked science fiction, I'm guessing you still like science fiction.
Yeah.
Me too. I'm a big science fiction fan. Dustin also, and I like to read some Perry Roden. And
All right. Yes. Yeah. The famous author in Germany. Yeah.
Yeah, and also like the artwork. And in those big books, you sometimes had these drawings of the spaceships. They were very detailed, and I loved it. Yeah. Since you're a researcher, how do you go about doing research for your books, for example? Do you try to get hold of reports or do you interview pilots?
So I think for the time period I'm looking at the moment, so bearing in mind that what I've been writing about up until just the present time is up to the mid 1950s, then it's very difficult to interview the people who were sort of involved in these sightings because unfortunately they're pretty much all passed away now. Or if they're not, then they're almost in their probably in the late 90s, early 100s, if you like. So it's incredibly difficult to get a hold of people who were involved in those situations. However, people have asked, am I going to extend this series of books out into the 1960s? And that's the intention at some stage. So I will get to a point where people will be sufficiently still around that I'll be able to contact them and interview them for future books. But at the moment, unfortunately, I'm basically confined to looking at intelligence documents, newspaper reports from the time, and also a testimony that's been written down by the witnesses themselves and has been sort of included in newsletters and other publications. So that's the way I do it. In terms of the Foo Fighters book, it was looking through squadron records and some records that people had never looked at before. So there are cases that are from the Foo Fighters of World War II that are quite well known. There's maybe a half dozen to a dozen cases which are fairly well known. They're certainly in the literature. But there were dozens of cases which had never been looked at before because simply people hadn't gone through those particular records. And I seem to be the first to have done that. So that was quite nice to do that.
Yeah. One of your books is called UFOs Before Roswell. What are your thoughts on the Roswell case itself? What were your thoughts when you first heard about it?
Roswell, one of those things when you first heard about it, I know where I was because it was the early 1980s when it first sort of came into the British psyche, if you like. So it was about 1980 when the book appeared, the Roswell the incident, and people talking about it in the UFO field in Britain, and it was one of those things where it was like, wow, it's like people, even though it was so long ago, even then it was what, 30 odd years prior to that time. And it was just the idea, the concept of a possible crash, a possible retrieval, and then a possible cover up. And it was, I guess it was just like everything at once, if you like. It was just this huge story, almost too good to be true. And then obviously, as we've gone further forward in time and people have looked in depth at the case, and we've had many more witnesses come out of the woodwork and said that they had some limited involvement with this particular story. Some of those witnesses, unfortunately, have turned out to be, well, let's put it this way, frauds, if you like, or not telling the entire truth. So I think that the further we've got away from Roswell in terms of time, the less we understand and the less we're sure about. So I think now, looking back over, it's now what, 1947, and we were getting on for like 80 years, sort of thing. I hate to say it, but it's just, I don't know where we are with Roswell, and I don't think anybody has a particular handle on exactly what happened there. There's something no doubt happened in terms of something, really strange, but what that was and the extent of it, whether it was a crash, whether it was something that was covered up, were there bodies, all the rest of it, all the things that people know about Roswell and they've read, I really just don't know what is true and what isn't. And I think a lot of people now, because all the witnesses effectively have passed away, that I think it's incredibly difficult at this point in time to be able to work out exactly what did happen. We might stumble across some amazing archive of information or the mother lode of a crashed craft sometime. It might be disclosed, but until then, I think people are just scratching around trying to work out exactly what happened.
Yeah. And when we talk about Roswell, of course, we have to talk about Bob Lazar. What are your thoughts on Bob Lazar?
Well, he's another one, isn't he? It's a case of when he came out and he told this amazing story to George Knapp back in the day. Again, it was one of those, wow moments where you feel like you're on the threshold of this amazing discovery. If only there's a little bit more that can be told and, that can actually prove this, then it would blow the lid off the whole thing. But then, unfortunately, as you go a little bit further forward, in time, and more information comes out and people check his backstory, he's not. Let's put it this way. If you wanted to have a perfect patsy to have as a fall guy for something, he'd be the ideal person because he's got a bit of a checkered past. He's some of the stories he tells, I'm not sure they don't quite add up, but they're not. It's just one of those things where you can't put your finger on it, if you know what I mean. So and he's a bit, what this expression called, he's Marmite. Either you love him or you hate him. There's no in between sort of thing. And I just think at this point in time, I simply don't know what to think. Something else will come out, and I think, oh yeah, well that's quite incredible. And then somebody else will point something else out about him, and you'll think, actually, yeah, that's right. Yeah, he's a bit kind of shady. So you sort of veer from one side to the other in terms of, do you believe him or do you not? And I just end up in the middle somewhere. And I know that's really a horrible thing to say, that I'm just sitting on the fence and I don't have a particular opinion. But I've heard so much about him that I simply don't know what to believe anymore. It's a bit like Roswell in that respect. The further you get away from the time in history when this is supposed to have happened and he's supposed to be looking at these 9 spacecraft in this hangar, in this facility in Area 51, you just don't know what to make of it anymore. And again, it's one of those things where I defy anybody to go, yeah, that's definitely right or that's definitely wrong.
I agree with you. I feel the same. Not too long ago, Dustin informed me that there is such a thing out there that is called the Roswell Rock. Have you heard about the Roswell Rock?
No, I haven't. What's that, Justin?
Justin, give us a little insight.
Yeah, what was the guy's name? I'm gonna mess that up. Remember?
No.
The guy who did find the rock. So this guy was, I don't know why he was out in the area, but he was horseback riding and he saw this rock, this kind of half buried in the sand, and he jumps off and he clears it off and he sees this. I don't know if you have a picture of it, Daniel, if you could pull it up, of this weird symbol basically. And there was a crop circle that popped up in the UK, I think 3 years before this guy found this rock. Is that right, Daniel? Am I getting that right?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, this rock had mysterious properties where it had weird magnetic poles where you take a magnet to it, it would spin crazy. And this guy actually had this weird attachment to this rock, and I think Giorgio Tsoukalos went and actually did some testing on the rock, just weird properties.
Yeah, and it was found near the crash site of the so-called Roswell UFO. That makes it interesting. So could also be a hoax, but who knows? Or
Yeah, the cynic in me says it's too good to be true, but the kind of the person who got into UFOs in the first place tells me inside my head goes, you should really read a bit more about that, Graeme. So I'm going to do that.
Yeah,
yeah, you should.
Yeah, not the worst idea. So I think its name was Robert Rich. Robert Rich found the rock.
Yeah.
Okay.
Robert Rich.
We will send you some informations.
Thank you.
So, but let's get into one of your books. I'm really interested in this one book that I mentioned before. It's called UFOs Before Roswell, European Foo Fighters, 1940 to 1945. What is this book about, Graeme?
So, as the title says, it's about the Foo Fighters phenomenon of World War II, not the Pacific side, because strange things were seen in the Pacific War as well during the Second World War. But there's been some story, a kind of legend built up about what the Foo Fighters were during World War II. And I guess I looked at it, and actually I found more information that it suggested that the geographical spread, but also the time involved, was much more widespread than it had originally been thought. So I thought it was an idea to write a book about just the entire UFO phenomenon during World War II, because it's much wider than a lot of people seem to think. And the legend, if you like, that's been built up since World War II, basically thought that it was a limited phenomenon. It happened only to the U.S. Air Force, the U.S. Army Air Force in World War II, and it was 9 fighter pilots who were seeing them over a particular part of Belgium, Germany, and France. Over a very limited period from, say, November 1944 till the end of the war. But actually, even that part of the phenomenon, the pilots were seeing them as early as September and October. If you look back at the records and you delve deeply enough, the Americans were seeing them in northern Italy as well at about the same time, and certainly into 1945. But I stumbled across RAF squadron records, which had statements about the strange lights following aircraft when they were flying missions over the Balkans in 1944. So you're going back to March 1944 and then right through to the end of the war. So these were aircraft that were based in Italy that were raiding targets in Czechoslovakia, in Hungary, in Romania as well, against the synthetic oil fields. So these are stories that have never been seen before. They've never been seen, certainly in UFO publications. So that was brand new. But then there's also stories that were coming out of obscure, certainly obscure to the English language kind of readers, in French UFO publications from the 1950s, 1960s, about certain things which had happened in the continent during World War II as well. But then I dug up a whole load of other things which I'd never really seen in print before, and I put it into one book. So, it was to give people a kind of a rounded kind of explanation of just what happened during World War II. So it wasn't just lights that were following airplanes. Some bomber crews, say as early as November 1942, were seeing craft. They were seeing 200, 300-foot long torpedo-shaped craft over northern Italy, and they were reporting them. And this information was being sent up the chain of command as well. And then I was in the midst of actually looking into things that were happening even earlier in the war when I published the book, and I'm still looking at things at the moment for a follow-up public sort of book to that one. And these are lights which are following aircraft as early as March and April 1940. So that's really early in the war, and the RAF bomber crews are reporting that lights are following their aircraft. So it's a wide-ranging phenomenon that goes way back in the war, much earlier than people sort of suspected.
Has there been any reports of Foo Fighters during World War One?
Somebody did write a book about that. There's a guy called Nigel Watson in Britain. He wrote a book, and I've never read it, unfortunately, so I don't know enough about that. But there are, things from then as well, and some of the Korean War as well. So, different conflicts have a lot of cases like this. But my focus was on World War II and also on the European theatre. So it was Europe, Italy, and the Mediterranean. So yeah, things like that happened. And if you see the artwork from the cover, which is behind me here, there was a bomber crew. The air gunners actually shot at a UFO in March 1942. That was a Polish crew. And then there was a Hurricane pilot in spring 1943 fired at a light that was chasing him over North Africa. So, things like that happened during the war as well. So these aren't well-known cases, but they certainly had. They certainly, according to the witnesses, happened.
Dustin, you might want to show your pictures that you got.
Yeah. Well, I have one of these original photographs. I'll pull it up so you can see a bit closer, but I just want to show you that I have the physical thing here. Here, let me just pull them up here. On the back of the photograph, it said that let me just read it here.
Well, that's a B-36, isn't it?
Yep, that's a B-36 that took off.
I can see the engine pods on. I can see the jet engine pods on below the outer wings. So and reverse facing propellers. That's definitely a B-36.
Right, and then I guess an F-84 crashed nearby, like a block away from where this photograph was taken.
Okay.
So it makes you. I heard that the Foo Fighters actually interrupt instruments in the airplanes too.
Well,
yeah. Is that a myth? Is that a?
It's a myth in so much as it came out of a book that an Italian guy wrote in. Well, he wrote it in the 1950s, but didn't get published until the end of the 1960s. And basically, he suggested that the Germans had invented something that would interfere with aircraft ignition systems. But unfortunately, he provided no proof to back up his theory and his claims. And nobody's ever really come across anything yet, apart from there's one document that is a flight of aircraft, an American fighters, where they all came back with kind of problems with their engines. But this document is out of place in terms of where it appears in the records. So it's not quite as if it's been planted there. It just seems, it's not where it should be. So it's one of those things where it's a bit of an outlier. And I'm not sure what to think, because there could be other reasons why an engine kind of spark plugs in an aircraft could go, could be faulty. And it was one of these things that was just thrown. Did the Germans, have something that might have interfered with the engines, but the line of questioning went nowhere in terms of the records, and they never found anything after the war that could suggest that the Germans did that. So yes, it's a bit of a myth, but it's one of those long-standing ones, because obviously you're talking about it, and I've heard it from so many different places as well. But again, there's nothing really to back it up in terms of evidence. But that blob next to the B-36, was that the supposed UFO in the photograph? Yeah. It's a pity, isn't it? Because it's quite grainy and we don't know exactly what it is. But it's certainly interesting to see the image on the photograph there. Which just wish it was a little bit more detailed, because I could certainly see what the aircraft was.
Yeah, I actually own a few other photographs. 2 years ago, I won a box full of photographs from Colonel Wendell Stevens' storage locker. Yeah. So his storage locker was up for bids. And I have a bunch of these photographs that have UFOs with jet fighters and other very interesting photographs. This was taken back in 1994.
That's a B-1.
Yeah, right. And
then, I know what the aircraft is, but I can't speak to the objects. I'm certainly not a photo analyst, so I've got no idea whether the photographs are true or not. And yes, and an F-117.
Yeah.
So these are amazing. I haven't seen these before.
You ever seen the F-117 photograph series?
No.
These are beautiful. Yeah, there's 12 of them that I have.
Now, I mean, there's just something that comes to mind straight away. There's this mark on the picture where it's like if you see there on the above the UFO, there's that strange little mark, or those two little kind of marks on the picture, and that's the same obviously in both pictures, isn't it? So it's obviously the same camera that's being used, that's using it, because I can see it again there.
Right.
But did I see that on the same image on the earlier one with the B1 as well?
I don't know.
So I'm sure I saw another mark on there. I might be wrong.
Yeah,
that's interesting.
But again, it's beautiful. Just
using the same camera by the looks of it for the same images, obviously, because that's really good. These are really weird. So when were these taken?
Apparently 1981.
Okay.
In Nevada, nearby. I'm not exactly sure where, but again, just very mysterious.
Interesting.
Interesting, as you say.
Yeah, Graham, you're very interested in aircrafts itself, so you have a few books out about aircrafts, right?
Yeah, well, as I said before, I've been interested in airplanes from like the age of 4, sort of thing. So again, it was another one of the things where you start, you amass a lot of knowledge. I even went to Siberia to look at airplanes back in 1992. So I traveled around northeastern Siberia as part of a little tour to photograph, obscure airplanes in remote areas. So, and I wrote a book about that when I came back. So yeah, I've written a few books purely about airplanes. But I think in terms of the UFO side of things, the Foo Fighters, all those 3 things I was really interested in came in together there to write that book. So, aircraft from World War II, but I was also interested in German secret weapons and UFOs. So everything came together with that book. But then the other books I've written since then, Dawn of the Flying Saucers and Flying Saucer Fever, and then the new one, which is Intercept and Identify, they all have this aviation angle. So they're looking at just pilot and aircrew encounters. So I feel like I can bring something to the table to, explain some of the aviation terms, identify some of the aeroplanes, because that wasn't done for some of the cases. But actually, when you look at the records, it's quite easy to work out exactly which aircraft was involved, even down to the tail number, etc. So things like that I've been able to pull into the books. But some of these cases, beyond occasionally a couple of lines in a book somewhere, they've never really been discussed. So it's quite nice to actually grab the intelligence reports and see at length what was discussed about these cases and put it in a print for people to read.
Please tell us a little bit more about cases, encounters with Foo Fighters. We're very interested.
But the Foo Fighters, okay, well, here's one. So the artwork behind me, I'll elaborate a little bit on that. This is March 1942. It's a Polish crew flying an RAF Wellington bomber, and they've raided a place called Essen in Germany, and they're on their way home. They're flying over Holland, and the tail gunner shouts to the pilot, there's an orange light coming up behind the airplane. So, of course, everybody on the airplane thinks it's a German night fighter because, well, what else would you think it was? If it's flying, it's got a light on it, it must be a German airplane. So the pilot says to the tail gunner, if it gets close enough, open fire at it, which he does. So there's like tracer bullets and machine gun bullets going at this light, except nothing happens when they hit the light. They just seem to get absorbed by the light. They don't go out the other side. The aircraft, this light doesn't catch fire. It doesn't fall out of the sky. It doesn't look as though it's being destroyed. It just sits there, and it's coming close at the aircraft. And the tail gun is still firing at it. And all of a sudden, the light then moves round to the wing of the airplane, sits off the wing. And it's just sitting there as the plane's flying through the sky, the bomber's flying through the sky. And the tail gunner, he turns his turret as it's flying around, and he's still firing at the light. And then because it's sitting at a distance off the wingtip, the nose gunner of the Wellington bomber can also turn his turret and open fire at the light. So both turrets are firing at this light, and nothing's happening. It's just sitting there. So it can't be a German airplane, because if so many bullets hitting this light, if it had been an airplane, it would have fell out the sky. It would have been destroyed. Anyway, after a minute or two, it then flies and takes station in front of the airplane, off its nose. And it's just sitting there as the airplane's flying through the sky. And the nose gunner, again, is firing at this light. And all of a sudden, it just shoots off at 45 degrees in the heavens and disappears. Wow. When the crew get back to their base, and they're on the ground and they're being interrogated by the intelligence officer to find out what happened during the raid, they mention this thing. And the first thing he says, have you been drinking? That's what he asked them, because he thought they were drunk. But as it happens, the crew of the aeroplane behind them in the bomber stream flying over Holland had also seen the light as well. So there was a corroboration of sorts. But in terms of official records, you can't get anywhere with this case because there's simply nothing to back up the story. But it was an incredible kind of tale. And it was first told in about 1962. The Polish pilot by that time had emigrated to Canada, and he told this story to a reporter who it was then published in Flying Saucer Review, which was a British UFO newsletter, which appeared it was 1962 it came out. So yeah, it's quite an old story, but it's one of those that practically nobody's heard of. There's not many people who have actually heard of that particular case.
Yeah, wow, it's interesting. Wow. Do you have another story that you can give us without giving your whole book away?
Yeah, okay. So there's a French chap. He was actually France when after the Germans invaded, and he was near his local airfield, which obviously was by then like being used by the Luftwaffe, and he saw this kind of curious cloud formation. And he saw what he described as being Henkel's and Junkers aircraft flying around it. And as they got to a certain height, then he said that their engines stalled and they fell out the sky. And then obviously the pilots, regained control and tried again, kind of thing. It was this curious thing, but he got chased away by German guards, so he didn't see what happened to it at the end. But that's not the real part of this story. Turns out 2 years later, he was part of the German the labor organization. He was caught up and he was taken abroad. He was taken to Poland to work in a German factory up near in the Baltic coast at a place called Gdynia. Anyway, there was one day he was nearby and he was in the sand dunes near this port, and he had a day off and he'd gone somewhere with permission. I think it was for a job interview in another part of the plant or something like that. Anyway, he was on the coast and he saw this kind of strange craft that was half buried in the sand dunes. Now he thought it was a German kind of a very secret airplane which had crashed, and he was quite skeptical. He was quite wary because he thought if he was going to be seen near it, he might be in trouble or he might be shot. But as he kind of looked at it from a distance, he could see there was somebody trying to dig it out. It was a figure in kind of what he thought were flying overalls trying to dig this thing out of the sand dune. It was half buried. And it turned out to be a woman, apparently, from how he described it. And he tried to converse with this person, but it was very difficult because she didn't speak English and she didn't really speak a language that he knew. But by hand gestures and all this kind of thing, she kind of motioned to him to help to try and dig this thing out. Anyway, he did. And then it climbed into it and it kind of spun round. It had these kind of contra-rotating top and bottom halves that spun in different directions, and it flew off. So it was this really weird craft with this female, I suppose, test pilot, if you like. Now he thought it came from Peenemünde, which was a German research establishment for, well, not just the V2 rocket, but also flying bombs, for a lot of surface-to-air missiles and some very secret airplanes. Which was just up the Baltic coast, a little bit to the west of where he was. And he thought it might have come from there. He didn't think that at the time because he didn't know about Peenemünde, but after the war, when he read about all this kind of thing, he thought, oh, well, that must be where it's from. But it turns out, obviously, nothing like that was built there. So that's one of these stories where you just think, what was that? And it's obviously something that's never come up anywhere else. A very, very strange flying machine with a female test pilot.
Huh. Great story. So your latest book is called Intercept and Identify: Aerial UFO Encounters 1953 to 1945.
54.
54. Sorry.
Yeah, it's all right.
Yeah, I messed it up. Sorry. So it just came out on April the 7th, I think.
Yep, it just came out a couple of weeks ago. That's right.
Still brand new. Tell us a little bit more about this one.
Yeah, so let's say there's can I do the cover? Oh no, you can't do covers when I've got a virtual background. Anyway, but I suppose I've come up with a series of books which look at various pilot and aircrew encounters. So the Dawn of the Flying Saucers were looked at 46 to 49. Flying Saucer Fever looked at 50 to 52, and this one, as we say, looks at 53 to 1954. So we're just after that kind of frenetic activity of 1952, where we had the two weekends in Washington, where UFOs were effectively ruling the skies, and the US Air Force couldn't do anything about it. And then they had that infamous press conference afterwards where the US Air Force tried to put a dampener on the whole subject. And the press as well, sort of bought into the explanations that there was nothing, really sinister going on. There was nothing to worry about. And the kind of excitement and the hype and the feverish reporting that was developing in the American press sort of died down a bit. But the only thing that didn't die down were the number of UFO reports. So when you look at the the intelligence files and you look at the kind of the official reports and the investigations, the numbers of claims of people seeing things was pretty much the same. People were still seeing strange objects and strange lights in the skies right across the world. And 1953 and 1954 were no real exception to that.
There's a foreword in your book by Priscilla Stone and Sean Rash. To my shame, I have to admit that I never heard about these guys. Who are these guys?
Oh, well, they're podcasters. So, and also they're friends of mine. So Sean comes under the name of Witness Citizen, and he's one of these people who loves looking at old documents. And he'll pick some documents and he'll discuss them on his show. But he also interviews people as well. So he's interviewed a lot of people. He's interviewed Luis Elizondo before, and a whole rash of other people that you'd know. And Priscilla, she runs something called the UAP Book Club. And I was the first, and she likes to sort of pick a book, talk about it, but also she likes to try and get the author on. And of course, the first book she picked for the inaugural episode was UFOs Before Roswell. So she asked me to come on. And then I've been part of the panel since then. And we've met in New York. We're at a conference in New York in last December. So we met up as well. So they're all really, really good people. And anybody who wants a different podcast to listen to and watch, I recommend that they listen to theirs as well as yours.
Yeah. I will. We will check them out.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was gonna say, is there any stories maybe the German Nazis might have had of the Foo Fighters? Because I think both sides were seeing the same thing.
Yeah, this is the really wonderful thing, that if I had a pound for every time somebody said the Germans saw them too, I'd be rich. But proving it is a different matter. And I think at the moment they're anecdotal stories. Now, again, like yourself, I've heard things where people have said, yes, the Germans saw them too. Yes, there are kind of pointers to that where there's supposed to be prisoners of war statements. So when the Allies, when the British and the Americans took some of these pilots prisoner, then there was talk about this. But I've yet to find the records where that's discussed. Now, I'm not suggesting they don't exist. I believe they do, but it's just finding them. Now, in UFOs Before Roswell, I basically collected every story I could find that is to do with German sightings of UFOs during World War II. So there were a couple of UFO reports by pilots, one of which unfortunately is a hoax. And it's a hoax because of various things I go into in the book, and I go at length of that. But also there were some other stories as well. People on the ground who had seen things. So there are stories. And there's even one story, which is actually quite nice, where it wasn't even Germans, but they were fighting on the German side. So some people will know that there was a Spanish division that fought with the Germans on the Eastern Front during World War II. It was the 250th Infantry Division, known as the Blue Division. And they fought up on the Leningrad front in 1942 and 1943. And there was a battle in February 1943, just near Leningrad, and it lasted 3 or 4 days. But on the first day, one of these Spanish volunteers, there was a group of them actually in a bunker in this pitched battle, and they could see Russian and German aircraft, fighting like dogfighting above the battlefield. But above it was something that they described as an upturned bathtub, watching what was happening below. And that was quite a tale. And actually, the person who reported it was probably one of the first ufologists. He was a Spanish guy, and when he came back home, his parents had seen something in 1945 as well in Spain, and he started talking about that as well. So he's regarded as one of the first European ufologists. He was called Bray. He was. That's quite an interesting story as well. But it's one of those kind of things where that's another little-known UFO case. But if you look hard enough, you'll see it like described in a few books, but mostly foreign language kind of sort of publications. So including in an English language book was quite good because it gets a wider audience.
And I heard too, I don't know if this is a rumor or not, that the Russians were shooting them down during World War II over Russia.
There's certainly Russian stories of Russian bomber pilots and Russian fighter pilots coming across very, very strange things. Again, it's difficult to corroborate those stories because of the Russian secrecy. Their records are impossible to go through. Sure. So you can't, check to see whether units and personnel are, the right names, the right squadrons, the right aircraft, the right places, all that sort of thing. But yeah, definitely intriguing tales. Of them meeting strange craft. Even some hints of crash retrievals as early as 1941. There's a story that's in the book of something that crashed on an island in the middle of a river, Rostov-on-Don, down near the Crimea. So there's kind of hints at stories. But I suppose without corroboration and without official documentation to back these up, you've got to, again, take them with a little pinch of salt. It's not to say they're not true. It's just that, they do bear sort of, need to have a bit more kind of scrutiny and a bit more kind of in-depth kind of, research before you can definitely say, this should be part of the overall legend. Daniel, I really ask, and this is a good opportunity to ask somebody in Germany, what's the kind of take on the Foo Fighters in terms of German sort of witnesses in Germany? How much is discussed about that?
I know that it is discussed by certain people, but I really don't have any deep insight into the topic. I don't know. I can't tell you. I'm sorry.
That's all right.
I really don't know. I really don't know. I really have to look it up. I know there's people who are interested in the topic and doing some research, but I have no deeper insight into all that stuff. No.
Because that would be the logical place for people to start in terms of people who had relatives as eyewitnesses.
Yeah.
This kind of thing. Much like some of the research that was done in, say, the 80s and 90s in Britain and America, people managing to talk to some of the surviving pilots. Obviously, they're all past now, but that would have been the time to probably, if anybody was going to do it in Germany, would have been to do it about back in the 90s when a lot of these people were still alive, albeit fairly elderly. So
if I will come across somebody that knows more than I do, I will connect you guys.
Oh, wonderful! Thank you. That'd be great.
So, since you talked about crash retrievals a few minutes before. Not too long ago, we had a few wild weeks when it comes to UFOs and UFO shooting downs and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So what's your take on that?
Well, apart from the first one, which was probably a Chinese spy balloon, because I think it was tracked back to source, wasn't it? From somewhere on an island off China somewhere. And it had that big kind of instrument package underneath it, the guy in the Midwest photographed. That's what that one probably was. And there was obviously some kind of hand wringing in terms of, well, should we shoot it down or shouldn't we shoot it down? And then we'll wait right until it flies right across America and it's over the Atlantic Ocean, and then we can shoot it down. But the other three are much more kind of intriguing, because there's been almost an information blackout about those, hasn't there? Because they've been very cagey about talking about showing the film, because they must have had targeting imagery about what they shot down. It's the way it works nowadays when they launch missiles and things. They also have sensor data and they have sometimes optical information, sort of imagery about what they're downing. So and also you've got that. Just as a little bit of a tangent, you have that drone that was downed by that Russian jet over the Black Sea, and they managed to release that information pretty quickly, didn't they? When it suited their purposes in terms of trying to drive a political point, then that came out within 24 hours, 48 hours of it actually happening. But if you're trying to look at something that was shot down over Alaska or somewhere else over America, over Canada, there's just like crickets, isn't there? It's just quiet. You can't hear a thing, and they haven't released anything, and they won't tell anybody about it either. Beyond they shot a sidewinder at one of them. And it cost, was it $600,000 or $450,000 or something to fire a missile or something that might have been a hobby balloon for $20.
It should raise some eyebrows.
Well, yeah, but I mean, all flippancy aside, it's quite serious, because clearly there was a problem with with the air defense of the United States, that there was these things flying over with relative impunity, presumably because they weren't being detected. Now, if you translate that then to UAP or UFOs, as a lot of people still call them, then you've got a problem, because if you're filtering things out, what are you missing? So and why aren't you trying to detect these things? Do you know what they are, and that's why you're not bothered about them? Or is it something that you've just sort of let slip under the radar, not just metaphorically but actually physically? It's something that they've had to address, and I think there's been collective egg on faces, and that's probably another reason why they're keeping quite quiet about it, because of this kind of collective embarrassment, if you like, that some huge modern high-tech air force can't track a whole load of just sort of balloons flying over their airspace, which is pretty low tech, really, isn't it? It goes back to the 1950s, and hell, they should remember their history, because the Americans did strap cameras to high altitude research balloons and send them over Russia in the early 1950s. They still launched them from a place in Scotland, which I know about.
Do you have a personal UFO encounter story?
I have a personal one, but it's not very exciting. It was when I was about 12, 13 years old. I was in my local school. It was a day when the school wasn't on. I was just happened to be playing in the playground. And I looked over towards where it was near Newcastle Airport. Was where I used to live, a city in the northeast of England, and the local airport there. And it was near the flight path to the airport, to the approach. But it wasn't an airplane that I was looking at. It was like a teardrop on its side, and it was orange and silver. And somebody who knew about aircraft even then, I could tell you what the shape of any aircraft that came into Newcastle was, and a lot of other aircraft besides. And I knew straight away that it wasn't something that I was familiar with, and it just looked so strange that I just started watching this thing. And I looked at it for maybe it seemed quite a long time, but it probably was only maybe 10, 15 seconds and all told. And then it disappeared behind a cloud, and that was it. I never saw it again. And it wasn't a hot air balloon. It wasn't a microlight. It wasn't a glider. It wasn't a jet aircraft. It was nothing I'd seen before. And I don't know how far away it was. I don't know how big it was because I had no frame of reference. So because I couldn't tell how big the whatever it was, I can't tell you how far away it was either, and vice versa. So it's one of those very, very strange things. But yeah, that's my story. But for what it was, it's not very sort of significant on the overall scale of things. But yeah, it's my particular case.
Oh, wow. I think it's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Started your journey.
Well, yeah, I'd been interested in UFOs for like a couple of years by then, but it wasn't one of those things where I'm going to make up a story kind of thing. It just by happen, one of these kind of chance, kind of looking up in the right place at the right time and thinking, oh, what's that, sort of thing. I mean, people, who are interested in the subject go through their whole lives without seeing things. Other people have, in multiple encounters with stuff. So I guess I'm either lucky or unlucky, depending which way you look at it.
Yeah.
What do you think when you hear stories about alien abductions, for example? What is your take on that?
I guess I've always had a little bit of difficulty trying to relate to these because I've got no common frame of reference. It's not something that's happened to me. So I can't put myself in somebody's shoes to actually try and, empathize or kind of relate to it. But it's not that I don't believe people. I believe they have had some kind of experience. But as to what that is, beyond going on what they've said, I can't try and work out whether it's real or not because I don't have that common frame of reference. But clearly, going by what a lot of people have said, it's something that's really intensely personal, sometimes quite horrific, very, very occasionally quite euphoric as well. There are both sides to these things. They're not all very, very sinister. Some people come away from it with an amazing feeling of well-being, and all the rest of it. So there's a whole range of experiences that people have gone through. But clearly there's something to it because so many people over such a long period of time have had these amazing and quite sort of strange and sometimes terrifying experiences. And sometimes it's not just a single kind of thing. Often it's things which are repeated time and time again. It's almost like whatever's happening just keeps occurring, and not just once, twice, three times, and a lot of other times. So that there's something going on there as well. I mean, I guess the only thing is that you look back to some of these, what they used to call the contactee cults of the 60s, and clearly some of those were kind of money-making ventures, if you like, people coming up with stories which clearly have been disproved over the years, and that they built up a kind of following, and they were actually extracting money out of people for books and for talks and things like that. But I clearly don't think that a lot of the people who come out with have stories and tell about their experiences nowadays, I don't believe they're the same kind of people. They're not out just to make money from these things. Something's clearly happened to them, but trying to get to the bottom of exactly what it is and why it's maybe different for so many different people, because it's not the same story all the time. If it was the same story for everybody over these 20, 30, 40, 50 years or whatever that's been happening, then you might be able to pin it down to one particular phenomenon or one particular thing. But because people seem to see different types of beings associated with their experiences, they have different sensations, they seem to go into different craft, or there's other different things that happen. Trying to work out and trying to explain what's going on is incredibly difficult, if not impossible.
Yeah, I agree. So there's so many ideas and opinions where these UFOs or USOs sometimes may come from. Do you ever break your head over that?
Yeah. Yes. I've thought long and hard about it for over quite a long time. So since I started reading about it in the late 1970s, then yeah, I've had a long time to think about it, and I'm no further forward. Because you can take your pick as to what the origin of these are. You can say yes, they're extraterrestrial, have come half a universe to get here, or they're time travelers, they're us from the future, or they're ultra terrestrials, they're the people who live amongst us, or they're just like a race of beings under the sea. You can pick any of them. It could be something else completely. It could be something that not only can we can't imagine, but we simply are unable to imagine. We're just not capable of imagining. So, it could be any of those things. And there's so many different things involved. I mean, not just the experiences, as you mentioned there before, but you've got, kind of people seeing strange things, different shapes, different sizes. All their kind of experiences seem to be completely different, even just seeing UFOs. The shape, sizes, and speeds, and activities, and the way they fly all seems to be different. They're trying to pin it down to one particular source seems impossible. And do they come from whole different places? And that's quite possible. So if it is, it could be that we're being visited from people from other planets. They're coming across, interstellar distances to get here. But we could also have time travelers. We could also have people who live here as well. It could be everybody. It could be all those things and others as well. We just simply don't know.
Yeah.
Or it could be something completely different that we haven't even considered yet.
I agree.
I'm sorry that's a cop-out answer, but that's the best I can do.
It's completely fine.
Do you agree that there's been a lot more UFO sightings during wartime in general?
I think the way to explain it would be that in terms of things that happened during World War II, for sure, there were certainly a lot more trained observers flying around. And you have, soldiers on the ground who are trained to spot things out of the ordinary, and all the rest of it. So you have a huge amount of people flying through the skies every day, day in, day out. You have a lot of people on the ground who are acutely aware of what is happening around them, because the last thing you want to do is be taken by surprise and be taken prisoner or being shot at or being killed. So, everybody is on high alert, and they're always intensely watching what's happening around them. So naturally, you're going to get more reports. You're naturally going to get reports of things which don't look correct, out in the ordinary, which aren't the run-of-the-mill thing. So, and that's not just World War II. So you can apply that kind of thinking to any other conflict as well. So I think that's why you get, this kind of, glut of reports every time there's a war, sometime, whether it's World War II, whether it's Korea, even the First World War, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's possibly the reason, or one of the reasons why, that happens.
To finish up this episode, Graeme, the last words are yours. Tell people where they can find your books and everything else that is important.
Okay, thank you. So if you do an Amazon search for my name, Graeme Rendall, that's the easiest way to find out where the books are. They're all listed there. So, if you want to do that, that's perfect. They're available on Kindle. They're available as softback and hardback. So it's not a problem. I bring out probably maybe one book a year now, so I'm quite prolific. It's quite fun actually writing. But if you want to find me in social media, I'm mostly on Twitter, so it's @Border750. So that's how you can find me. And I do accept direct messages. I'm happy to speak to people as well, so no problem.
Okay. Thank you for taking the time. It was very, very interesting, Graeme. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I appreciate talking to you guys.
You're welcome. Please stay with us for 2 more minutes, okay?
Sure.